There was a young man lived back in hill country of around in Tennessee area. And when he was a young man, young boy actually, very young boy, he was out walking around in the woods and he came across a family of badgers. And the badgers, he got a little close. The badgers do what badgers do. And of course, they came after him. Didn't really hurt him much, but scared the dickens out of him. He was pretty shooken up, traumatized. Well, this young man never really forgot about that experience. And as he grew, his aversion towards badgers grew also. It got to the point where he was not liking badgers very much at all. As a matter of fact, you could say he probably hated badgers. And, when he got old enough, his daddy let him have a gun, and he would go around looking around where he lived for badgers. And, this went on, and he never really forgot about that. And you could understand that. I mean, he was traumatized, and you could understand his feelings about badgers, being terrified of them, and, now he's hating them. So as he grew up, and he still always carried that around with him, and he always had guns. He got his own place, got married, had kids, and he had a gun in every room. He taught his kids how to hunt and, told them about badgers. His wife, they all were trained on how to kill a badger if one came around. And, that seems a little extreme, doesn't it? That this fellow would do that even when he got older. But you can understand it, right? I mean, he had this trauma that he went through when he was very young. But we can understand that, right? But what we don't understand is that he lived, when he grew up and got a job, he lived in a 5th floor apartment in downtown Seattle. There's a twist to that story that I'm going to tell at the end of the lesson. What I'm going to talk tonight about, I've talked about the influences on the church in different lessons, the view towards authority that many people have today, which is not good. We talked about negativity and how we look at things. I also taught a Bible class about the influences of the teaching community or the scientific community and what they espouse as truth. Tonight I'm going to talk about something a little different, and this is really kind of a hard thing to teach or to preach on because it affects every one of us in ways that we may not want to explore. I'm going to talk tonight about hate. The definition of hate, in the Greek it's miseo, M-I-S-E-O. It's a malicious or unjustified feeling towards others or things, and it's also the right feeling of aversion from what is evil or wrongdoing. The relative preference for one thing over another by way of expressing either aversion from or disregard for, like the impossibility to serve two masters. Jesus said, you'll love the one and hate the other, right? Now, I understand that in the United States here, for Christians, there's not a lot of hate that is shown to Christians. I've heard in some stories, I'm sure that you have, Glenn mentioned one about something going on in Canada where they were doing something against Christians. I've heard of other stories where people are, trying to get rid of, religious influences in the government. And it seems to be more and more prevalent as we go along. But it's not really bad here in this country, United States. However, in other places, in the world. It is bad. Christians are persecuted. You know, in some of the Muslim communities, I've heard stories where people are taken out and they're killed for their faith. Some of the Bible examples of hate that we're going to be getting into in just a second will show us some of the different ways that a hatred can come out in a person. One of the things about that I wanted to bring this out was because I feel as I get older, and if you're an older person also, I'm sure that you can sympathize that it just seems to me like hatred and dislike for Christians or religion is growing. And I can't imagine what it would be like in school for a young child, person going to school these days. I know what it's like in the workplace. I've heard some horror stories about people getting fired because of, I knew a fellow that got fired because he was talking about his faith. As for me, when I was told that in my workplace that I could not talk about my faith, that I could tell dirty jokes, but I can't talk about my faith. I've known people that got verbally attacked, and I was one of them that got verbally attacked for the faith. And I've known people that also were verbally attacked at a restaurant when they were praying before their meal. So it does happen. Not so much here in the United States, but brothers and sisters, I think that it's just going to get worse with the things that are going on now, and I hope it doesn't. I really do, but I think it's going to get worse. And so I wanted to bring this lesson for us to help us to maybe prepare for some of that in our attitude and some of the things that it might do to influence the church. Some of the examples of hate in the Bible, Cain and Abel was the first one. Now, Cain's sacrifice was not accepted by God. And God said to him, "Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be rewarded? But if you do not, beware, sin is crouching at the door." And later on, as you know, Cain was in the field with Abel, his brother, and he killed Abel, his brother. And I think, why did he do that? He was a murderer. Now, you just don't murder just for no reason. For some reason, this hatred in Cain welled up against his brother. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was something else. Another example of hate in the Bible, if you remember the story about David fleeing Jerusalem from his son Absalom in 2 Samuel 16, verse 6. He was fleeing from his son who wanted to take over the kingdom, and he was afraid that his son was going to kill him. It's another example of hate. Really, it doesn't say that Absalom hated his father, but here again, he wanted to kill him and take his kingdom from him. That's not an act of love. But as David was fleeing, there was a man named Shimei, the son of Gera, who came out from Jerusalem, and he was following along the percussion of David and his followers as they were leaving Jerusalem, and he was throwing rocks at him and cursing him, throwing dust up in the air. And I'm wondering, I look at this story and I look at some of the things that I see about protests today, and you look at how some of the protesters are yelling and screaming horrible things at other people, what they say and what they do, violent. I mean, that is not an act of love. That is an act of sheer hatred. In John chapter 3 and verse 20, Jesus said, "Everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest their deeds be exposed." Jesus spoke of hatred towards himself, towards God in heaven, and towards believers on account of him. And I want to read in John 15, in chapter 15, John 15, verse 8 through 25, because there Jesus does say some things that I think is really important for us, especially in verse 24. In John 18, he says, in John 15, verse 18, he says, if this world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you were not of this world, and I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I spoke to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. If they had come and I had spoken to them, they would have no sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin, but now they have both seen and hated me and my Father as well. But they have done this in order that the word may be fulfilled, which is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. Now, I understand that Jesus is talking to his disciples there, and he's talking about the Jews. But the same goes for us today. We are chosen out of the world, and because Jesus loves us, and we are his followers, they're going to hate us, just like they hated him. They were going to want to kill us, just as they wanted to kill him. I wouldn't make any, bets against it. It's probably going to happen one day. If it maybe here, maybe not. I hope not. But the thing that really sticks out to me about in verse 25 is that they hated me without a cause. There is no reason, none whatsoever, for a person to hate a Christian. We are, by faith, we're told to love one another, to love our enemies, to do good deeds. We're told to obey the laws of the land or to subject ourselves to the government. We're told to love our enemies. There's absolutely no reason why anybody would not want to love a Christian, because they're good citizens. They're good people. But they hate them. Why? Because they believe in God and Jesus Christ, his Son. I know many people that believe in a lot of different things. They're not looked down upon or hated because they love Buddha or love some other deity, so-called. But Christians are hated because they profess that Jesus was the Son of God. In Matthew 10:22, he said it again, you will be hated by all on account of my name. The student is not above his master. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 13, he says do not marvel if the world hates you. Our response to hatred directed at us because of Christ, the response that is given to us on how we should look at this, let's look at Luke chapter 6 and verse 22. He says there, blessed are you when men hate you and ostracize you and cast insults at you and spurn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. And he says, be glad on that day. That seems like an oxymoron to me, to a natural man. If you're hated and they're persecuting you, you're going to be happy about that? Be glad in that day? For a natural man, that doesn't seem reasonable. For a Christian, we can understand that when we are doing what we should be doing, something's going to happen. Now, as long as you're going, if evil's this way and you're just following along and not doing anything about it, if you're just following along, you're going to be okay most of the time. But when you turn and you face it down, that's when trouble's going to happen. Now, I know this because I've been in that situation. That when I turned against evil, evil come right at you. It happens. Matthew 5 and verse 44, our response should be to do good to those who hate us, to love our enemies. Romans chapter 12 and verse 17 says, never return evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. And again in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and 10 through 12, he says, blessed are you when you're persecuted and hated for my name's sake. And in verse 12, it says this, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And again, it's because you should be glad if that happens to you, because you're doing something right. You're in very good company when that happens to you. Which one of the prophets did they not persecute? They persecuted them all. As Christians, I can't imagine these days what it would be like to be a young man or young woman in school having to profess the faith, knowing how kids are. It could be very hard. Some of the vehicle that hate takes is prejudiced, jealous feelings, injustice, fear. Hatred can be displacement, angry at one thing but venting on something or someone else. Hatred is also used to justify guilt by vilifying somebody else. And I'm not concerned that Christians will hate, but I'm concerned what Christians do when they're hated or persecuted. In the first century, it is written that the Christians in Rome had a meeting and they were talking about those who had burned incense to Caesar. So what they would do is set up an image of Caesar, and you had to go by and you had to burn incense to Caesar. And I'm sure that they did that as a trap, so that those who were not going to burn incense, they would arrest and take to do whatever they're going to do to them. There were some Christians who did that, and some of the other Christians wanted to know if they should go ahead and forgive those Christians that did that. It can happen. When we have this fear of persecution, everybody wants to be liked. No right-thinking person wants to be hated or not liked. But that action we take out of fear of being hated or persecuted can cause us not to profess our faith and speak to others about Christ. And when you bow to the pressure to hide your faith, there's a saying that was not written in the Gospels, but is attributed to Jesus in one of the extra writings. It says, when you hide your faith, your guilt will rise up against you. And I can understand that. Sometimes when we try to do the good things, but we're hiding our faith. Maybe we're afraid, so we put our light under a basket, like it says. We don't really get out and talk to people because we're afraid we don't want to be disliked. It's hard in the workplace. I know. It's hard in the workplace when you go out and you try to talk to others about Christ, because there's always that fear of, maybe the HR department will come and knock on your office door or pull you aside and say you've done something that you shouldn't be doing, or being ostracized by your fellow associates. Nobody likes that. Going and go talk to a neighbor about the faith, that may not be a pleasant visit. You never know what's going to happen. You think about this young man that I began to speak about the badger. You never know how people are going to react, what is transpiring in their mind, how they're going to react to something that happened early on in their life. It could blow up and become something very ugly in them. And you could be in the way, and it could just spill out all over your life, not because you wanted it to, not because you did anything wrong, but just because that's the things that people do. There's also something else, and that is that we need to be careful of, and that is indifference. Indifference is a very tricky thing in that we could do this without really knowing it. And I'm going to give you an example of indifference. We talked a little bit about Cain and Abel. This is similar to that. So let's say in a family you have two children. One of the children you shower with affection and love, and you give them things, and you're always talking to them, and you're holding them and hugging them. But the other child, all you do is give them what you're obligated to give them. How do you think the second child is going to feel? You may love them, but you don't really show it like you show the first child. What is the second child going to feel? You're being indifferent to him, but how is he looking at it? He's looking at maybe you don't like him, or maybe you hate him. Indifferences can be a very tricky thing. That's why we're told to show hospitality to strangers in action and in word. And it's not being cordial. It's not being friendly and greeting them. It's taking them in. That is the important part. Because being cordial is one thing. Hospitality is something else. And one of the things that we don't want to do is be indifferent to people. So, some people are odd. Me, I'm odd. I understand that. I have my axe to bear, my cross to bear, things in my life, my mind, the way it works. I understand that. There are other people that are like me that I see that may not fit in, that may be socially awkward. I think that a lot of times it's hard for us because it's out of our comfort zone to go and put ourselves in a situation that may be a little uncomfortable for us. Be careful of that, because the person that's seeing that may be feeling that you're treating them with indifference. And that can drive somebody away from the faith. I want to talk about the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10 and verse 27 through 37. And we all know the story of a Good Samaritan, and that is that there was a robber that was in a ditch, and as he was laying there, he was left for dead, or somebody that fell among thieves, and he was left for dead there. And a Levite priest came, or a priest came by and walked on the other side of the road, and a Levite came by and walked on the other side of the road, didn't help him. And then a Samaritan, who the Jews had no dealings with, the Samaritan, he came by, he bandaged up the man, put him on his horse, took him to an inn, told the innkeeper, hey, whatever he needs, give it to him. When I'll come back, I'll pay you whatever is needed. Give him what he needs. And the point of the story that Jesus was telling this was, who's my neighbor? How do I treat my neighbor? And that's where this story came from. So I want to talk a little bit about this story and the people in it, because I think that in a very real way, most of us could probably be anyone in the story, any one of the individuals in the story. Talk about the injured man. Now, the injured man fell among thieves. Who knows? He fell among thieves because he was a thief. Maybe he was a bad person and the thieves wanted to get even with him. Who knows? Through a spiritual eye, he's a sinner paying the consequences of sin. In our lives, in your life, as you go out in your life, driving down the road or wherever you go at the store, do you ever see anybody that you feel may have fit this description of this person? I do. I see them every day when I drive to work. They're sitting on the side of the road. They're homeless. They have marks all over them because they've been taking drugs. They're in horrible shape. I'm sure that you see them too. The priest passed by on the other side of the road. He didn't want to get involved, and they had a good reason why they didn't want to get involved. You know, this was an unclean sinner, they thought, and, you know, he's laying in the ditch there bleeding because he's deserved to be there. You know, that they thought that if this guy had something happen to him, it was because God was punishing him for whatever he did wrong. But, you know, the priest, it's funny because they were the ones that were supposed to take the sacrifice to make atonements for sin. But yet this priest walked on the other side of the road. He didn't want to get involved. What is our attitude towards people that are weighed down in sin? Do we walk on the other side of the road to avoid them, maybe because it's outside of our comfort zone? Now, I'm not saying you do. It's just something to think about in this story. The Levite passed on the other side of the road. The Levites, it was a religious government, so he was really the government. What should their attitude should have been about victims of crime? They didn't want to get involved. What should our attitude be towards victims? It could be in a spiritual eye. It could be victims of the devil and his schemes and the things that he does to people. And then we have the Good Samaritan. He went the extra mile, not just immediate help. He got involved. He did something that was out of his way. That's what Jesus says our attitude should be towards people. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's very easy for us to get into a place of not being comfortable with dealing with those people around us because it scares us a little bit. We don't want to get involved with them because, you know, we've been told horror stories or, you know, who knows what they'll do. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is who's our neighbor. You may be doing very well. And one of the things about preaching that I was always told and I always believed is that you preach to yourself. So I'm preaching to myself here. If I happen to touch a few nerves on you, great. I hope you do something about that. And I hope you don't have to. I really do. But let's look at a little side note with the victim. What would he think of the priest and the Levite when he saw them walk on the other side of the road when he was laying in the ditch, bleeding, left for dead? What would he think about them as they walked on the other side of the road? Now, maybe he was an innocent man. What would he think about them, just leaving him there? Would that make him feel angry or hurt? Would that lead him to hatred? Hatred of the people that left him there? It might. It just might. Let's look at another story, and that's in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22 through 28. And in this story, this is kind of an opposite story, an antithesis as it might be to the last one. In this story, it was a story of a Canaanite woman, and her daughter was demon-possessed, and she was following along and she was crying after Jesus, Jesus, Lord, help me, help me. And the disciples were saying, Jesus, send this woman away. And he turned to her and he says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, I don't know if you've ever been called a name before, but it'd be a pretty hard thing to have somebody that you admired so much that you were calling Lord to call you a dog. I've been called names before, and it doesn't sit well with me. And in this society, the way that we were raised, somebody calls you a name, them are fighting words, right? So, but he called her a dog. And what was her attitude? Because of her faith, she said this, Lord, but even the dogs feast on the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus said, woman, your faith is great. Let your daughter be healed. And her daughter was healed. And I think sometimes about Jesus and why did he say that to her? He knew all things. He knew this woman's heart. So I'm thinking that he said that for the sake of his apostles and maybe us, to help us to understand what our attitude needs to be when facing something like this. Her faith was great. The point is, for all of us, is to be on guard. Because the fear of being not liked or persecuted can paralyze us in our service. And it can do some other things too. It can help us to be indifferent towards people that we should be a little bit more caring towards. There is no reason for a person to hate a Christian. No reason. There's none that I can think of. It's only in their minds that they should do that. And if I was a non-Christian, I would consider this as to why would I want to hate a Christian? What is behind that? Where did I get that from? Where did that come from? And who's behind it? Who would push me towards that attitude? If I understood things, if I was thinking correctly. And then that should tell me who my real enemy is. And I would want to get myself on the right side of the Lord. Believing that Jesus is the Christ, because if I don't believe, I'm going to die in my sins. I need to repent of my past sins and the things, my past attitudes that were wrong and wicked, and get myself right. Because in times past, as it says in Acts chapter 17, verse 30, God winked at ignorance, but now he calls all men to repent through Christ. I need to confess. I need to tell people. I need to go out and confess to people that I believe in Jesus Christ and that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. And then I need to be baptized for the remission of my sins. I need to go down in the water, because in Mark 16:16 it says to believe and be baptized, and if you don't, if you disbelieve, you're going to be condemned. And then I would rise to walk in newness of life. Thank you, brethren, for your attention. If there's any that have a need, why don't you come as together we stand and sing.